Okay, we are down to the final presentation of the afternoon. So 3 down, 1 to go. Great job all together, guys. I want to also, while we're here, is just, we had a lot of people behind the scenes that made this happen. Our creative team, our folks from Co.Lab, our events team. Let's give them a round of applause for their weekend. Team Blue.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're excited to be here in Chattanooga, FreightWaves, and in Freight Alley. I'm Joe, round of applause. I'm Joe Carruthers, and we're Team Blue.
I'm Kenichi.
I'm Neil.
I'm Thea. I'm Lindsay.
All right, our problem statement was to provide the optimum, the prime solution for Ben Murphy and Daughters to transform themselves to meet the demand of those contracts and the general demand in the Southeast region. We broke it down into further problems of selecting a seaport, an HQ location, and then most importantly, scaling warehouses, expansion and placement. Within that, we looked at location, cost, 3PL versus in-house transportation, and then risk mitigation. Through a lens of balancing time, capacity, and inventory, or in other words, lead time, shipping costs, and holding costs, we looked at this problem. We concluded that we didn't have as much control over the lead time from Shanghai, so what we're really doing is balancing our shipping costs versus our holding costs, and you'll see that shipping costs that we're currently paying from Atlanta to ship all over the Southeast, transitioning to more holding costs through implementation of warehouses across the Southeast.
Thank you. So, Ben Murphy and Daughters currently operates within a small radius, serving only Southeast Tennessee, North Georgia, and North Atlanta. Importing their products from Shanghai to the port in Charleston and their distribution center located in Atlanta. Currently, with the $140 million in new orders, they are faced with the problem of expanding operations rapidly to be able to serve significantly larger areas and to effectively scale operations to support these areas. And considering the shipping and holding costs, the trade-offs between shipping and holding costs, we recommend the following. Sorry. Okay. The first is to relocate the port of entry from Charleston to Savannah, capitalizing on the fact that the port in Savannah can handle twice the volume of ships when compared to that of Charleston, as well as a higher percentage of container ships. It has a direct rail line to Chattanooga. It has better interstate infrastructure and relatively lower timeline, approximately 26.5 days.
In addition to this, our second recommendation builds on this, and we would recommend that Ben Murphy and Daughters leave the Atlanta location and move their warehousing as well as distribution capabilities to be closer to their headquarters in Chattanooga. This not only capitalizes on the direct rail line from Savannah to Chattanooga, but also allows them to capitalize on the fact that there is a freight talent pool in the city already, that there are lower warehouse rent costs, lower traffic, and just lower labor costs in the city. Our strategy also relies on expanding by opening 3 warehouses across the Southeast, namely in Memphis, Tennessee, Greensboro, North Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida. This model has a few strategic advantages, but they're all built on 2 major assumptions. First is that our drivers can drive approximately 50 miles per hour for 11 hours a day with 1 hour for break. So we said that corresponds to approximately 200 miles if they want to do a single day trip and come back, and 500 miles if they drive one way, stay the night at their location, and then drive back the next day, which would incur overnight costs as well for those drivers. First, from Chattanooga, we're able to serve 3 out of our 7 locations within a half-day radius. So that would be Gilbertsville, Kentucky, Decatur, Alabama, and of course Chattanooga itself, allowing drivers to come back and not have to incur those overnight costs, as well as keeping happier drivers and a larger talent pool that are willing to make that kind of a trip. Additionally, with the 3 warehouse locations, we're able to serve all of the remaining destinations within a half-day trip from those locations as well, and those circles are to scale. So this enables us to not only hold inventory at these 3 locations, but to reduce shipping costs from those locations as much as possible when we're trying to reach any of those 7 destinations. Finally, from Chattanooga, we have all of our locations, our warehouse locations, being served in a full day's trip. So this would relate not only to resupplying our warehouses from Chattanooga to Jacksonville, Memphis, and Greensboro, but also to enabling redundancy and flexibility in the supply chain so that you're able to, if need be, to account for spikes in demand, go from Chattanooga to, for example, Little Rock or Tampa or Charlotte in a single day. In the short term, these full-day trips from specifically Memphis and Greensboro would also enable Ben Murphy and Daughters to service the e-commerce locations, we're calling them, in Dallas, Texas, and Youngstown, Ohio. This would incur additional costs, of course, because you're making that full-day trip and you have overnight costs per diems that are associated with it. However, we can see this being mitigated by taking backhaul freight from those locations back to the hubs of Memphis, Greensboro, or any other locations that are along the way. Additionally, because we have these large full-day radii, we have the flexibility across the entire Southeast region for when they choose to expand and however they choose to expand. In this case, most of the Southeast is covered within a full-day radius by at least 2 of the warehouses or Chattanooga inclusive. Finally, in the long term, we envision them, of course, scaling their operations. For the time being, we're recommending that Memphis, Greenville, and Jacksonville are rented warehouse spaces utilizing third-party logistics to service the final destinations. However, in the long run, we would recommend that Ben Murphy and Daughters continue to monitor not only the head haul index, but also outbound tender reject indices to determine whether or not it is more financially viable based on trucker supply and demand, as well as reject rates, to simply build their own fleet and expand personnel in those areas versus utilizing third-party logistics forever. We see that in Memphis, this would be one of those cases where you might have increased costs in the long run. However, that would be a stage 2 expansion for them.
Thank you. So all of this analysis is great, but what we really need to show in order to prove our recommendation is the data to back it up. So what we've got here is on the left-hand side of your screen, you're going to note 11 ports throughout the United States divided up between West Coast, Gulf Coast, and Atlantic Coast that we chose as potential ports to change to. And then across the top, we've got the 5 metrics in which we decided to judge them against. We first decided to look at the West Coast ports, specifically Los Angeles, Long Beach, Seattle, and Tacoma, because of the significantly shorter route from China, 14 days. However, once then doing the analysis based off of the rail trucking expense to go from the West Coast to the East Coast, we found out that wasn't a financially viable situation. Therefore, we decided to look at our Gulf Coast and Atlantic Coast options. While again, we see that they're significantly more accessible and they are relatively closer to our end destinations, the Gulf Coast ports are still farther out than the target market we're attempting to service currently today, which is that southeastern United States. And they're relatively more expensive and have a couple of more days in terms of transit time. So that left us a 3-pronged approach deciding between the incumbent situation of Charleston, Jacksonville, or Savannah as the new ports. Jacksonville and Savannah both have recently undergone extensive renovations and dredging processes in order to allow larger freight containers, more ships, and less wait time in port, which Charleston seems to lack at the moment. Additionally, Savannah actually has a day less in transit time to Charleston and has the direct rail route from Savannah to Chattanooga, and therefore we could utilize that in order to delay shipping time. So therefore, we ultimately chose to choose Savannah as the new port moving forward.
So we used a very similar structure when deciding on our warehouse locations. But first and foremost, why do we even need warehouses, right? In theory, we could just ship everything from our Chattanooga site out to all of our different customers. But let's not kid ourselves. First and foremost, we are in the truck driver business and the freight industry second. So we need to keep those drivers happy and ensure that we can have the best talent and attract and maintain that talent. And so in order to do that, our primary consideration was location. Neil explained earlier how all of our locations strategically fit together almost like a puzzle covering the entire Southeast to ensure that we can pretty much cover every location within a half-day or a full-day drive. That was really important to us. But of course, we need to make sure the other metrics match up against that. So we looked at effective price of rent for each of these warehouses, and it just so happens that Memphis and Jacksonville significantly benefit from cheaper warehouse space. Additionally, the vacancy rate is working in our favor in Memphis. We additionally looked at the head haul index and the outbound tender reject rates to ensure that we weren't entering into a risky location and that we might get inventory or freight caught up in each of these locations. So as you can see, Memphis does struggle with a head haul and an outbound tender reject index currently, but as we all know, those things can change, and that's why we recommend in a stage 2 approach, potentially allocating some of our resources there in the future and building out the fleet infrastructure ourselves. But altogether, these 3 locations had the best combination of these metrics compared to any of the surrounding options that we had across the Southeast, and also fit that puzzle that we were talking about earlier.
In assessing the solution to our problem statement, we looked at optimal routes. The one from Savannah to Chattanooga can be saved by 2 different modes, which is rail or interstate. And then from Chattanooga to the different warehouses, we can basically use the interstate system over the highway system. This is because the interstate system facilitates high speeds, and also it's well maintained compared to the regular highways. This is very important because of the climate in the southeast, which is the subtropical, which is very rainy. And then also we looked at the annual average daily traffic for those interstates. Upon entering the cities, there was very high traffic, but it is still a viable option compared to using highways.
Every plan, though, before it needs to be implemented, has to have the considerations of what possibly else needs to be looked at. We have the 6 most viable ones up here that need to be considered, but I specifically want to call out 2. The first, the cost increase. So we did speak about that 500-mile radius and that additional per diem nightly cost of a hotel and food that you will have to pay those drivers to stay out of town. If at some point in the future the demand of that specific location outweighs how much you are paying those drivers to stay overnight, you really should look at purchasing warehouse space or renting warehouse space to offset that cost and make it more feasible. The second one is delivery times. So we need to make sure that if these outskirt markets of Youngstown or Dallas continue to expand in terms of their demand, that we remodel our cities to make sure that we are capturing all of the demand. However, with the information we have now, we believe our market choices are the best ones we have.
Thank you very much. Again, we appreciate being here.
So you guys are, you made a comment I found interesting about hotel cost. Are they, your drivers, can you describe what kind of trucks they have and why they're staying at hotels?
Absolutely. So I actually personally am a CDL holder myself in my previous career, and I manage drivers of semi-trucks. So I understand how you have to book hotels out, and depending on the locations, they can either stay in the long haul overnights in their cabs, or if they're in smaller trucks, depending on CDLs or 24 or 30-foot trucks, you're going to have to book a hotel. Either way, we still have to account for a food expenditure for the employees and make sure that they have dinner, and then of course their gas allocation is paid for. So depending on what specific type of truck we're measuring, it's either going to of course be in their cab, but if it's a smaller truckload, then we would need a hotel.
Okay. You also cut out Atlanta, right? Okay, make sure that's clear. And you're moving all of the operations to Chattanooga?
Even better.
Well, it depends, right? I'd like to understand, when you make that decision, did you consider how many miles you're adding to your supply chain to do so? Can you dive into that a little bit more?
Sure. So the mileage you're adding is really relevant primarily from Chattanooga to Jacksonville, because that would be where you're losing that southern spacing between Atlanta and Chattanooga. One thing that we really kept in as a consideration is you're not losing any of the original radius for your customers, and that loss of space between the increase in mileage between Chattanooga and Jacksonville is offset by the ability to service Gilbertsville in Kentucky, which is a destination, directly from Chattanooga, which is something that you couldn't necessarily do from Atlanta itself. So that, in addition to the cost differences and the directness of the rail line from Savannah to Chattanooga, as opposed to getting it from Savannah to Atlanta and then shipping from there.
So you're using the new, was it Chats Northwest Georgia thing port thing. I should know the name, right?
Exactly.
It's that railroad line. That's what you're using, right?
Exactly,
CSX,
the one that's right at the port and
Got it.
allows you to ship directly from there.
And you feel confident that it's going to give you enough speed and velocity of freight to move into Chattanooga so you don't have to maintain your land operations?
Yes, we do, but that's why when we were looking at optimal routes, we also provided alternate routes via the interstates if shipping via truck is necessary. So as a secondary way to get those containers into the distribution center.
Did you weight any of the cities based on population stats to say how much demand you anticipate coming out of those markets and how many miles by located in Chattanooga, which may or may not be a primary driver of your customers? Did you weight how many miles that would increase your overall network?
We didn't provide a weighting. However, we did this strategically for long-term growth, right? So we want to make sure that even though these are our customers now and this is where we need to deliver to now, that we're well positioned and well prepared to grow in the future. And so if we actually want to be a Southeast provider, then we need to strategically cover each of the areas with relative consistency, right? And so even if you have a spike in demand up towards Washington, D.C., you could still cover it with Greensboro. And so no matter how the demand is distributed and where what population may be driving that, we feel confident that we could then adapt and change based on the risk mitigation that we've created by distributing our warehouses.
And just to add on to that, the original prompt does say that the current geographic location that our customers primarily live in is the North Georgia, East Tennessee, and Northern Alabama area. So by moving from Atlanta up into Chattanooga, we feel as though we're strategically placing ourselves in the middle of our current demand right now. Not necessarily taking in population to that, but where the orders are coming from currently today.
Jennifer, you're right. This is going to be hard. She warned us. I really like your Savannah recommendation. I'm on an international logistics company board, and we do a ton with Savannah and have really great service there. I want to know, what was the hardest decision your team had to come to a consensus in the last 24 hours?
When to stop.
I think that our team in general, we wanted to make sure that our presentation and our recommendations were data-driven and that we weren't just going with what our gut and what we thought was going to be a good recommendation. So I think that collectively, between all 6 of us, we probably spent the majority of the afternoon yesterday finding as much data as we could. And then we kind of realized we had a lot of data, maybe more than we needed, and we then had to pare through that data and really figure out what the story was that data was telling us.
Thank you, guys. Great presentation. I have a couple of questions. The first is, well, specifically on the Savannah port. So you evaluated Jacksonville as a port, and then you evaluated Savannah. Now you ended up with a port in Savannah and a warehouse in Jacksonville. And so did you guys consider that, the fact that by placing them apart, you're actually now, while I think Savannah was slightly cheaper than Jacksonville in that slide that you showed, now you actually have to ship from Savannah to Jacksonville, to your warehouse?
Yes, we did. And can we go back to where the ports are? Yeah. So when we looked at shipping time to Jacksonville, on average, it was approximately 5 days longer than Savannah. So even if we were to ship to Chattanooga and then down to Jacksonville, you're saving time there. The costs are, again, similar, but you can mitigate that by shipping direct from Savannah to Jacksonville if necessary.
But the costs are the same, right? So they're both $2,900, except that now you actually have to ship from Savannah to Jacksonville, correct? So
Correct.
You're actually adding costs.
Yes, and again, what we're seeing is that we're offsetting that cost increase with the lead time, because there is some amount we can play with it, but part of the issue is we have to maintain some sort of competitive parity or lose our customers, because if we're starting to now take 35 days to deliver what usually used to be 29 or 30, you're losing to competitors even if you might be winning on cost for yourself.
And how did you assess the risk and reliability, that column?
So what ended up going into these components was risk and reliability came down to whether or not we could make sure that that not only was there going to be a significant or ease of transport from these specific ports to where we needed to go in Chattanooga and then to our warehouses, but also that we also looked at the head haul rates in here as well. So Seattle and Tacoma had very high head haul rates, so that's why they were red here. And then we also looked into the ease of, is the port updated, for instance? Does it carry the type of container ships that we're looking for? Does it do the volume in which that we're looking for? And so risk or reliability kind of took in all of those metrics and bundled them into one package.
So a couple of questions. Number one, you seem to take a very risk-driven approach to your solution. How do you think about the potential upside, right? Like, where do you see the upside that you're gaining by moving the port to Charleston, by moving the headquarters and distribution center to Chattanooga? Were you able to capture any of that, what you thought the financial upside could be?
I think one thing that we considered in our warehouse location placement specifically is taking advantage of some of those backhaul rates from some of the delivery locations as well. So that's an additional revenue source that we aren't necessarily optimizing or using right now in our current operations. And so making sure that we strategically placed warehouses and locations that we could potentially see financial upside outside of our core business was a really important consideration for us. I don't know if you want to add to that.
All right, and second question, you're now kind of a second team that's really taken a very driver-centric approach. It seems that the ability to get your driver out and back in the same day is meaningful. Can you talk a little bit about the qualitative aspect of that and then the quantitative aspect?
Sure. So of course on the qualitative aspect, right, there is definitely a benefit to making sure that you have employees that not only are feeling satisfied with their position, want to come to work, and then of course people that enjoy their job or want to do their work tend to be safer drivers. So then if we're looking for an insurance perspective on there, we're hoping that having tenured drivers that are satisfied with their work then drive safer, and then they get the ability to come back every night. It just increases their desire to stay employed. From a quantitative spectrum, there, of course, is the fact of the driving per mileage, the overnight capacity of what you lose when that driver is out of town and not available. And just simply, if drivers are on the road every night and there's the ability for them to maybe get burnt out or maybe get tired, that turns a higher turn rate. And of course, recruiting, onboarding, doing the DOT regulations behind all that is very expensive. So it's in our best interest to make sure that we have happy, satisfied employees that want to stay on in the long term so that we're not continually onboarding, hiring, and going through those exercises.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you. I only have one question, and I think I'll throw back the same question that I asked the previous group is, you've taken, to Mark's point, you've taken a very risk-driven approach to this. I'd like you to touch a little bit on the operational risk that you see. And as a side note, I think it's cool that you put 2 in Tennessee. To my point yesterday of punitive damages cap being taken off, Tennessee is actually a great state in terms of mitigating the risk that you're being priced on. But could you touch on the operational risk that you may see?
Definitely. So as you can see, if we go back 1 or 2 slides where we have the smaller circles and the bigger circles. So we primarily want to use the warehouses at Jacksonville, Memphis, and Greensboro to deliver to those areas within the green circles, which is a day trip, so there and back. But we strategically place them where they could be reached by the bigger circles with a full day trip, so by multiple warehouses at one time. So that mitigates that risk a lot there. Anything to add?
I would say the one key operational risk that we face is if demand happens to spike in some of those outer-lying cities that we aren't necessarily servicing within a half-day trip or close to our distribution network currently, then that could cause a fundamental shift in how we need to set up our operations, right? And if they want to expand further outside of the Southeast, then we would need to continue to iterate this process and continue to move across the country, right? And so it's really just, and the other thing that I meant to mention is that the e-commerce sites, right, a lot of people ask, why didn't you put your warehouse right next to those, right? Because you want expedited delivery. Those are spikes, and so they are inherently a spike, right? It's not a trend. If it is a long-term trend, then we need to reevaluate and see if we're going to be able to fulfill those in a continuous and expedited manner. But without understanding those trends and without knowing that yet, we feel like this is the best approach for the current market.
Hey, sorry, maybe a follow-up, because I really like that slide, but the follow-up on that is, what does and as much as I love Chattanooga, what are you getting from the warehouse in Chattanooga that you're not getting from the warehouse in Memphis, Jacksonville, or Greensboro? Which customer locations are you reaching from Chattanooga that you can't reach from anywhere else?
So first and foremost is just a local customer base. So the original customers that the mom and pops that you have in northern Georgia, northern Alabama, and southeast Tennessee, you're not losing those. You're not moving further and further away from those. The other thing is, with just this risk-focused approach, we want to have redundancy in the supply chain while minimizing redundancy in the costs. So when we have a distribution center or a warehouse in Chattanooga, it not only allows us tighter control over how it's run over there, so you're able to better maintain processes, but it also creates redundancy in some of those corner markets that might otherwise just be served by one warehouse, and especially those regions where, even though right now we're only looking at those key cities, we have regions in, say, North Georgia or mid-east Alabama that are within that Chattanooga circle but aren't within the others.